How is it going, everyone? Dylan here from All You Can Board, finally back with a Marvel Champions review. This time we're taking a look at Nebula. Now, you may have thought we were going to be taking a look at Mad Titan Shadow next. I thought so too, but we have not received Mad Titan Shadow here in Canada, or at least not where I am in Canada. So I am still waiting with bated breath for that. I got the notification from my local game store, the email, saying that there was a new product in for Marvel Champions. I assumed it was going to be Mad Titan Shadow, but I was surprised to see it was Nebula. Hey, I'm still pumped to review Nebula. I'm just pumped to have new Marvel Champions content finally arrive here, but I am noticing that we are getting a whole bunch of delays. So I don't know when I will have Mad Titan Shadow. I don't know when I'm going to be getting, the Hood and War Machine, all this stuff. At this point, I am just going to see what happens when I receive stuff, and believe me, as soon as I do, I will be getting the content to you guys. So if you don't say anything on the channel, it's just because I have not received it yet. So with that being said, we have a nice little stack of cards here to talk about with Nebula. Obviously, there's some duplicates in here, but a whole bunch of cool stuff to talk about. Nebula is pretty interesting, so I have enjoyed my time. I'll leave most of my thoughts to the end of the video, but I just want to say that Nebula is a pretty unique hero, and I will say that I think that it's not going to be one that necessarily everyone is going to love. I think that it'll depend on your play style. It's sort of like Scarlet Witch for me. I know some people love Scarlet Witch. I am not a huge fan of that playstyle for Scarlet Witch, specifically for me. But again, I think that it's just one of those ones that's going to have a bit of a, I don't want to say polarizing effect, but just that it's not going to be for everyone. I think Nebula slots in there pretty nicely. So let's jump right into this. We are going to talk, of course, about the hero card first, and we're going to talk about the alter ego side. So the alter ego side of Nebula is a recovery of 3, hand size 6, hit points of 9. We'll come back to that. The hit points are a little bit on the lower side. The ability here is Cybernetic Upgrades, which is response after you play a technique upgrade, draw 2 cards, limit of once per round. So much of what Nebula is doing has to do with these technique upgrades. And if you remember playing against the villain version of Nebula in the Galaxy's Most Wanted expansion, you'll have an idea of what these techniques are. So she has a whole bunch of one-cost upgrades. I believe they're all one-cost, and you're going to be constantly playing them, and they all have these special abilities attached to them. These special abilities are going to trigger when specific cards call for them to be triggered, or otherwise they're going to be triggered by the hero side, which we'll get to in a second, and essentially they'll be discarded. So you're going to be going through these upgrades constantly. When you play one on the alter ego side, you are going to draw 2 cards, which is basically going to recoup the 2 cards you spent, the one for the upgrade and then the 1 resource you paid for it. You're going to refill your hand after having played that upgrade, potentially being able to get into another upgrade or another technique upgrade. So you can only do this drawing cards thing once per round, but it is a key thing of Nebula's playstyle. You're going to be finding that you're going to be flipping to alter ego a lot more than you might be used to, depending on the heroes that you've played with. I know for me personally, a lot of times when I play, I'm obviously still flipping to alter ego, but I'm not flipping nearly as much as I am with Nebula. Nebula, you're almost wanting to flip every single turn if possible, because it adds to the longevity of your technique upgrades and the timing of when they're going to trigger, but it also allows you to get these extra card draws, which is really, really essential. So alter ego is super important for Nebula. I would say that outside of the ability, there's nothing crazy or fancy going on here, but the ability is key. You're going to want to try to hit that as often as you possibly can. So let's jump into the hero side. So the hero side of Nebula has 2s across the board, 2 thwart, 2 attack, 2 defense, pretty solid stat line. Hand size of 5, pretty standard. And of course, we already said the hit points of 9. Combat Protocols is the ability here. Forced response after your turn begins. Resolve the special ability on each technique upgrade you control, then discard each technique upgrade resolved this way. So the key being that this is forced. You cannot choose. You have to do this, but it's after your turn begins. So if you begin your turn in alter ego, you do not have to do the trigger of the forced response. Hence why you're going to be switching the forms more often than you might be used to, because you might want to start your turn in alter ego, have your special ability cards, your technique upgrade cards stay in play. They all have these special abilities, but they all have these persistent abilities as well. That will allow the persistent abilities to stay and actually be in effect on the board for longer, and then it won't be to your next turn if you flipped when they're going to all trigger and discard. So you want to try to get as much life out of these upgrades as you can. That's one of the biggest things, and even more so than getting the most life out of them, you want them to trigger at the most effective time. If the villain has a tough status card, that's not the most ideal time to trigger the one that does 4 damage, because it may just be removing a tough status card. So you have to make sure you're trying to play in a way that really solves the puzzle of when you want to trigger them, how many you can trigger at once, and how much you got out of them by being able to trigger the specials with other cards before they end up in your discard pile. So that's sort of the puzzle you're solving with Nebula. That's where there can be this trickiness element where you don't always feel like you're doing things most effectively, or you're wondering what the most effective way to do something is, or you're just finding that certain cards are fizzling and you were expecting them to have more of an impact because when they trigger, the board state has changed. So that's sort of the battle you're facing with Nebula. But that being said, we're obviously going to get to her technique upgrades right away, and there is a lot of really cool stuff happening there. So I really think the stat line is awesome. I think the ability is really cool. It might seem like a downside because they have to trigger, but that's what you want to eventually do. You want to trigger all these specials. If you do it at the opportune time, it should not be a negative. That is Nebula. Let's move on to Gamora. So Gamora is an ally, but as we'll see later, she's also going to be a Nemesis, which is what we saw in the Gamora Hero Pack as well. So Gamora, the ally, is pretty darn good. I was about to say pretty good, and someone was going to call me out in the comments for that again. I still got called out in the comments by the odd person who has caught me saying that. So 3 cost ally, 3 health, 2 thwart, 2 attack, 1 consequential damage on each one. The response is after you play Gamora, choose a technique upgrade you control and resolve its special ability. So it's pretty standard, but exactly what you would hope from an ally in this specific hero. Again, the more ways you have to trigger these special abilities effectively outside of the forced response, the better you're going to perform with Nebula, because as soon as you resolve them as part of her forced response, they're all going away, and you're going to have to basically start by rebuilding, up that arsenal again. It's almost as if, like, to a lesser extent, by far, you with Iron Man, you're building up Iron Man as you go, and you're constantly reaping the benefits of what you built up. Nebula, you're building her up in the short term and then losing everything and having to constantly be building up. So if you like the aspect of building up Iron Man, you're constantly building up Nebula and then having to lose these upgrades. Gamora is just one of the cards that's going to make them more effective before you lose them. So any of the really effective ones you have in play that you might be losing next turn, for instance, you can now trigger with Gamora an additional time before you trigger them as part of the forced response. So Gamora is really, really good. Plus, with the only a single consequential damage on each of them and the 2 thwart, 2 attack, you're basically looking at this as like I can also do 4 damage and soak up a huge hit and trigger one of my specials for a cost of 3. It's really solid no matter how you look at it. Every time I've drawn this, I've played it. I've never waited because there's always been a special in play that I want to utilize, and just having the ally with a hero that only has 9 health is pretty crucial, especially if you're playing solo. These allies are key. So Gamora has been a solid card for me. Yeah, I don't have much more to say about that. We'll see coming up, there's also a team up card that you're going to have an added benefit for Gamora. So all around, I think this is just an awesome card. Next up is Nebula's Ship. So Nebula's Ship is a 2-cost support. Exhaust Nebula's Ship, generate a wild resource. We've seen this across many different heroes in the game. It's just your resource generator. It is extra important for Nebula because this essentially pays for a technique upgrade. All the technique upgrades cost 1, so you can look at this as being able to freely pay a technique every single turn and have more utilization in your hand. On top of that, with some of the cards that come in here, I believe might only be one actually. One of the allies we're going to get to, I don't want to jump to it too far ahead here, specifically wants there to be mined resources and what you're paying for it with. This just allows you to basically hit that more effectively. And if you have any other cards that you've built your deck around that require specific resources, obviously the wild resource will be excellent for that. So nothing overly flashy, but I found that the games that I was able to get Nebula's Ship out, especially early, I just had a more reliable arsenal because the turns where I would end up with a lot of technique upgrades in my hand, I didn't have to worry about saying which one am I not going to play or how am I going to, I won't be able to play all of these. Nebula Ship allowed me to play more of them and have a more massive turn when they all triggered. So really solid card, but not overly flashy. Again, we've seen that across many heroes before. Next up, we have Cutthroat Ambition. So this is the first technique upgrade we're going to look at. This is honestly probably my second favorite in here. I think, I don't know. I shouldn't be rating them. There's too many good ones. I'm going to end up going back on what I've said. It's a really good one. So this is a 1-cost upgrade. When Nebula is in hero form, her attacks gain piercing and overkill, which is really great. And the special that will trigger is a thwart, remove 3 threat from a scheme. So for 1, to remove 3 threat, huge deal, especially because you have multiple ways to trigger this. You can't just look at this as, oh, I paid 1 and I removed 3, which already would be good, but you're likely going to have opportunities to trigger that more often. So yes, you may have paid 1 for this, and yes, it's going to guarantee trigger once to remove 3, but if you've also played Gamora, there's another 3. If you've also played some of the other cards we're going to look at that trigger it, there's an additional 3. So this can be much more than 3 threat just from its presence being on the board, and plus you get the added bonus of when it's out for the minimal amount of time it's out, you will also have your attacks gain piercing and overkill. So this is a really solid card, especially playing Justice, especially playing solo and needing ways to remove threat from the main scheme specifically. We'll see in this deck that there are cards that trigger specifically from removing the last threat on a main scheme, or an ally that we're going to get to where having no threat on the main scheme is a big deal. This just helps with all that. There's 2 copies of it. You will use this one a lot. There are times, obviously, and this always happens with anything when it comes to threat removal, where there won't be any threat to remove, and you draw this and you find that, like, hey, it would be great to be able to have my attacks at piercing overkill if it works out. But right now there's no threat in the scheme. Can I count on there being threat added? Is it even worth it over something else I want to do? Those situations will arise, but otherwise it's going to be a pretty solid card. And one thing I think this is, I'll mention this before I jump into too many of these techniques, is that all these techniques have this persistent ability and then the special ability. In the games that I played, I think you'd want to try to avoid playing these specifically for the lasting ability on them. So for instance, in this case, the piercing, the overkill. It's an added bonus when it's out. If it works out for you, great. But to hold back on a card and say, oh, right now that overkill wouldn't matter, but it might matter next turn. Really, for these techniques, I found that you're playing them for the special. If the special is going to give you any sort of usefulness, it's just an added benefit if the lasting effect also, works out for you. Otherwise, just play them. It might work out, might work out for you, it might not. But holding them back for those reasons, or trying to find the opportune time for those specific parts of these techniques, I think isn't necessarily efficient. That's in my specific play testing, but again, there might be specific scenarios where you absolutely need one of those abilities and it makes sense. I would just say, as a general rule of thumb, you're probably playing it more for the special abilities and in terms of when you time it. So next up, we have Evasive Maneuvering. So 1 cost upgrade. While in hero form, Nebula ignores the guard keyword, the patrol keyword, and the crisis icon. And special, choose to either stun or confuse an enemy. So the big thing here is the stun and the confusing an enemy. This is a solid card. The amount of times that I was able to play this, trigger the special with Gamora or another card to stun the enemy, go to the villain's turn, have the stun come off, and then come back to my turn. I'm in hero form, this gets discarded and it stuns them again. This could, many times, this was essentially 2 stuns for me. This was a stun this turn and a stun next turn on the villain. 2 turns I didn't have to worry about the villain's attacks. 2 turns I could stay in hero form if I wanted and not have to worry about any extra repercussions. This is a really, really solid card when you utilize it effectively and time it properly. I love it. I'm just sad there's only 1 copy of these. I understand why there is, but I use this so much. The ignoring the guard keyword, patrol keyword, and crisis icon, sometimes it's situational. Sometimes it's going to work out for you, sometimes it's not. It's another one of those things where it's tacked on, and there's going to be times you play and you're like, man, this really worked out, because there happens to be a couple guard mains and I'm able to, kill the villain, or have to kill the specific form of the villain because I can ignore the guard keyword, or the crisis icon, and I really had to remove something from the main scheme. Whatever the case may be, it might work out. I don't think in any of the games I played, except maybe the last time I played Claw, I may have had, Defensive Network or something, that side scheme out that had the crisis icon, and I was able to ignore it to remove some threat from the main scheme. But it honestly wasn't that big of a deal. I would say that, again, you're focusing more on the special, and in this case, the special is really, really powerful. This is an awesome card. All right. Unyielding Persistence. This is a 1 cost upgrade, again, another technique. While in hero form, Nebula gains +1 thwart, +1 attack, and gains stalwart. Special, give Nebula a tough status card. This is my favorite technique when it comes to the lasting ability. 1 thwart, 1 attack, and stalwart is a huge bonus for 1. Again, because this is only going to be in play temporarily, that's why we can get away with such a powerful card for 1. But that is the best lasting ability out of all the techniques, I think. There are some good ones, but this one is just phenomenal. Again, you're only going to be able to utilize it in a small window, so it might not always be as effective as you would like it to be, but when it is, that is a huge boost to you temporarily. And the special is pretty darn good too, so giving Nebula a tough status card is really, really good. Again, there's ways you can do this where you can play this, give Nebula a tough status card by, also playing Gamora or some way to trigger the special immediately. On the villain's turn, it attacks you, or the minion attacks you, removes a tough status card, comes back to your turn, the force response on Nebula triggers, and you gain the tough status card back. It plays very similarly to the stun and the confuse. I'd say the stun and the confuse is better because you have more versatility and you're able to choose to confuse if that specific situation makes more sense for you. You can do one stun, one confuse, whatever the case may be. This is still really, really good. And again, the last ability I think is better. So awesome card again. You're going to be using it a lot. Every time I had that on my hand, I was usually playing it. Next up, we have Weapons Master, another super good technique. This is one you're going to be using a lot. Nebula doesn't really have, a lot of heroes have that one card or, multiple copies of card in their hero-specific cards that, their signature cards, that is a huge attack. This is the 3 cost to do 7 damage with a condition or whatever the case may be. Nebula doesn't really have that. And in lieu of that, what she has is these 2 Weapons Master upgrades that are 1 cost, and the special on them is deal 4 damage to an enemy. So, and the lasting effect is while in hero form, Nebula gains Retaliate 1, which is also really good. So this is surprisingly good. Like I found that more than I was expecting, I was able to utilize this 4 damage multiple times, and sometimes I had both in play, and if I had both in play, I was able to trigger one with Gamora, I was able to trigger one with what's called Lethal Intent, which we're going to be getting to right away, potentially triggering both with Lethal Intent, there's another 8 damage, then the Force Response, there's another 8 damage. This can really, really add up. You can easily create a board situation where you're able to do 8 damage with Lethal Intent, and then do 8 damage when the Force Response triggers. Potentially do another 4 damage with Gamora or something like that. Like, the potential is there, and the Retaliate is actually a pretty good. Like, when I specifically found it to be really good against Ultron because the bots only have one health. At least at a certain stage, they only have 1 health. And the Retaliate, I was able to take hits with Nebula and have all the bots basically die. And as we'll see from the next card, I was actually not even taking any damage as well. So it's a really good card. You're going to be using these ones a lot. This is your damage output. It's one that we get to a card called Combat Ready right away. I keep talking about cards in the future, but you need to sort of understand the strategy with Nebula. But Combat Ready allows you to gain cards back from your discard pile potentially. These techniques. These are great targets for that, especially if you're finding that you need to, get more damage output going on. I knocked it over. Getting more damage going on the villain or whatever if you're falling behind, especially if you're playing solo as a Justice hero. So Weapons Master is a really solid card, and you know me, I like my aggression decks in as it is. So anything that deals damage, I'm usually really excited about. All right, Wide Stance. This is my least favorite technique, I will say, but it did still have its uses. So this is 1 cost upgrade. While Nebula is in hero form, reduce the amount of damage she takes from each attack by 1. That's actually really, really good. It's probably my favorite thing about the card. Definitely is. Again, against Ultron specifically, I was taking 0 damage from all the bots because they all only deal 1 damage. This is really, really good. Again, it's only out there temporarily, but it is going to help you out in those certain situations. The special is look at the top 3 cards of the encounter deck, discard 1, and put the others back in any order. This is really, really good. Don't get me wrong. There's going to be times where the 3 cards you draw, there was going to be cards in there that were going to completely ruin the game for you, or there's going to be Shadows of the Past or something that now you have control over discarding, but also the order that they're going to come up in, you can plan. So don't get me wrong. It's really good. There was just too many situations I found for me that the specials would trigger, and it was just sort of like, oh yeah, I got to do that as well. And it didn't really have an overly huge effect based on the fact that, like, the cards I drew, there was, 1 that clearly sucked the most, and then 2 that kind of sucked as well, and I just had to decide which order did I want to get them in. And yes, it allows you to prepare, it allows you to sort of know what's coming up, but in general, a lot of the encounter cards I was dealing with, me knowing they were coming up didn't change the fact that they were going to suck. So it's still really good. It's still going to get you out of jams every so often. It still only costs 1 anyways, and the lasting effect on it is awesome. Being able to reduce each attack by 1 is really good. So overall, it's still a good card. I just think out of all of the techniques that are in here, so many of them are so good. That's the one that I was least excited about. All right, 2 copies of Combat Ready. Excellent card. Alter Ego action. So the key here to remember, because I definitely forgot this in my first game, you can only use this in Alter Ego form. Don't make that mistake. I did. 0 cost event. Choose 1. Shuffle up to 2 technique upgrades from your discard pile into your deck, or discard cards from the top of your deck until you discard a technique upgrade, put that upgrade into play, and resolve its special ability. The key there is resolving its special ability as well. This gets you whatever the next technique is on your deck, and then a way to trigger that special, and it's going to trigger the next time it gets discarded as part of the force response. So combat ready is really good. And actually, I use the second option way more often than I did the top one, funnily enough. But when I used the top one, it was a huge deal. I actually won a game because my deck was super low, and I had both of the Weapons Master cards in my discard pile, and I was able to pick both Weapons Masters, shuffle them into my really low card deck, draw them both in my next hand, and have my next turn be a massive turn because I already had a lethal intent. I kept it because I knew Weapons Masters would now be coming up. It can really shift the game. It can really win you games. Combat Ready is a solid card. Giving you that choice and costing 0 is just phenomenal. So you are going to use this a lot. Just remember, you have to be in alter ego form to use it. But again, you're going to be spending a lot of time there as Nebula, so that shouldn't be too big of a deal. Lastly, 3 copies of a super powerful card, which is Lethal Intent. You're going to be using this a lot. I use it every game multiple times, sometimes multiple times in the same turn. This is an X cost card. The X is choose up to X technique upgrades you control, resolve each of their special abilities. So you can choose how much you want to spend, and that's how many technique upgrades you can trigger the specials of. This is really good, and you don't always have to just use it in a situation where you say you have like 3 or 4 techniques and you want to trigger them all. There was plenty of times where I had 1 or 2 that just using this as an extra way to get some triggers before they trigger naturally off of the force response was a big enough deal. This can also just be like, think of it like your Weapons Master card, it deals 4 damage. If you just use this on just the Weapons Master, you're still only paying 1 for 4 damage, which is really, really good in a Justice deck, especially if you're playing solo. And again, you don't have to play Justice. That's what I was playing when I was playtesting Nebula, but that alone is really, really good. Even just removing 3 threat for 1 can sometimes be worth it. As soon as you can start triggering multiples of this, it becomes wild. So Lethal Intent is something I was using constantly. It was giving me so much range. I think there was a game I played against Ultron where on the second turn of the game, I beat his first form because of having the perfect mixture in my hand, my first hand, my second hand, of Lethal Intents, Weapons Masters, and being able to trigger them multiple times and basically just completely decimate that first form. So there's some potential here for these huge swing turns. If that's something you love in Marvel Champions, is when you have those massive turns where you deal like a ton of damage or completely decimate a form of a villain in 1 turn. If that's something you really like, Lethal Intent is your ticket that's going to get you there with Nebula, and Nebula has the potential to do that as a hero. Those are all the signature cards. Let's jump into the Justice specific cards. All right, we have 3 brand new Justice allies. I'm so pumped about this. I love getting new allies in the game. 3 new Justice ones is just, they're spoiling us with this pack. So the first one is Eros, I believe. I think that's how you pronounce it. So Eros is a 2-cost ally, 2 health, 2 thwart, 1 attack, a consequential damage on each. The response is after you play Eros from your hand, confuse a minion for each mind resource you use to pay for him. So this is, again, we see in Marvel Champions that 2-cost allies, low-cost allies, are always good as chump blockers no matter what. So we already have that coming for Eros. But the response here I used a lot because the main deck that you get with Nebula and the one that like all the cards come in here already have a ton of mind resources. So I was able to basically pay for Eros complete with mind resources every single time I played for him, no problem. I don't think there was ever a time that I wasn't able to do that if I chose based on the hand I had. So that was an easy thing to overcome. So you can almost just look at that. If you've built your deck properly around it, ignore the requirement, you know you're going to hit it, and it's basically confuse up to 2 minions. For 2 cost as an ally, they can also do 4 thwarting across the 2 health it has, or 2 thwart and then soak up a hit. That's a really powerful 2-cost ally, and especially if you're playing against a villain that has really powerful, really annoying minions, ones that you're wanting, because of how often you're flipping Nebula to alter ego form. If there happens to be a lot of minions out, that could all of a sudden mean a ton of threat going in the main scheme. This can slow that down, put a bunch, toss a couple confused tokens out there, slow the scheming, and not have to worry about it when you now go to hero form next turn, having to like do a bunch of damage control. This was a really, really helpful card. I played against Claw with the Masters of the Universe, and there was a time when 2 Masters of the Universe minions were out. Being able to confuse both of them, stay in alter ego form, not even have to worry about the extra threat going onto the main scheme, take my next turn and be able to like have a manageable board and not have to be like, okay, now I gotta find a way to remove all this threat while also removing these minions. It just, I was in a lot more control because of this card. So really solid 2-cost ally. I really enjoyed it. I think my first initial look at Eros, I was like, hey, this is gonna be good, but you know, it's situational. It totally is situational, but the situations are gonna arise more than you think, and even when they don't, it's still a really solid 2-cost chump blocker. So really solid ally. Next up, we have Wraith. So Wraith is a 3-cost ally with 3 health, 1 thwart that has a single consequential damage, and 3 attack that has 2 consequential damage. The hero interrupt is when a boost card is turned face up, exhaust Wraith and deal 1 damage to him, cancel that card's boost effect. This was surprisingly useful. I mean, and I shouldn't say surprisingly because you would think it's useful based on the ability, but I just for some reason underestimated how much I was going to use Wraith for the ability, and I use it a lot. And again, it just could have been bad luck on my part, but I kept, when I had Wraith out, drawing boost cards that had like 3 boosts on them that would have really wrecked me when I wasn't expected to take that much damage or take that much threat or whatever the case may be. And just having to only take a single damage on Wraith and exhaust them to be able to basically cancel that entire thing out. Like it's not like you're flipping it for another boost card. It's like draw the next card instead. Like you're completely eliminating that card's boost effect, period. And if that's also has a boost ability, that's eliminating that as well. So really powerful. And so, again, situational to the point that if while you have Wraith out, you happen not to draw anything that you want to cancel, yes, you might not feel like you got the most effectiveness out of Wraith, but again, Wraith still can do 3 damage with a single attack and also block another attack. There's still some usefulness attached to Wraith, but I think that you're going to find that you're often going to have some sort of boost that is in your best interest to cancel, and only having to take a single damage means you can do that up to 3 times with Wraith if you don't need him to block for something else as well. So I actually think this is a really good card. I think there's going to be times that people build decks to take on specific villains that the boost effect, there's enough nasty boost effects or enough situations where if you were able to draw a really bad boost in a bad situation, it can completely wreck your game plan, that just tossing one of these into your deck is going to allow for you to have some control over those situations. So I really like the ally, really like it. All right, the one that probably would excite people the most just because of the character itself, this is Venom. We have a Venom ally, the Flash Thompson version of Venom. 4-cost ally, 4 health, 2 thwart, 3 attack, which is really good numbers, but 2 consequential damage on each, which seems really steep. And the reason for that is, while there is no threat on the main scheme, reduce all consequential damage Venom takes by 1, which means it would reduce them both to 1 instead. So Venom is a higher cost ally, and it might seem very situational in the sense that if you have threat on the main scheme, Venom is not very good. And I would agree, Venom is not overly great if you have threat on the main scheme. In Nebula specifically, and I think in Justice Heroes specifically, if you built your deck around that, it's not that hard to minimize the threat on the main scheme, especially if you have a reason to do it, with that being Venom. I was very easily able to manage the threat on the main scheme to get the max use out of Venom. And if you include cards like First Aid as ways to heal some damage off of Venom as well, there was already a couple First Aids included in this deck, and I was surprised how often I was using them on Venom, because there would be times where I would want to attack with them and there was threat on the main scheme. So I would have to take the 2 consequential damage. Then I'd heal them off with First Aid, and then I'd be able to, by then, the threat's gone from the main scheme. Now I'm able to get more attacks with him, and it only does 1 consequential damage. Like, I was surprised by how useful I was able to make Venom when you really get him out and decide I'm going to try to maximize the effectiveness here and really cater my cards to that. Again, you can look at it as the fact that for 4 resources, if you're able to have only a single consequential damage trigger on each attack, that's 12 damage for 4 if you wanted to use the full max of what Venom has to offer and have him die based on his consequential damage. But even if you didn't, even if you did 3 attacks, 4 cost for 9 damage and blocking a hit, like there is tons of potential with this card if you're able to use it effectively. And yes, for sure, you're not always going to use Venom effectively, and there's going to be situations where it is a letdown based on the main scheme getting out of control or whatever the case may be. And if you're playing in multiplayer, it's going to be harder because there's more threat going out there on the main scheme. There's more threat to manage. It's not just up to you. Maybe Venom isn't as good, but in my solo experience, Venom was a really solid card, and the mileage of that 3 attack went a long way to being able to diminish the villain's health, especially because, Justice Heroes don't always have the most damage output to begin with. So I really liked Venom. I think it was an awesome card. All right, moving on. Allies done. Justice served. Play under any player's control, max 1 per player. This is a 1 cost upgrade. Hero response: after you thwart and remove the last threat from a scheme, discard Justice Served, ready your hero. This was pretty good. I don't think it's that great, but I think it was good enough is the best way I could describe it. For Nebula specifically, there wasn't enough times that I could thwart to remove the last bit of the threat to reliably have this trigger. And again, you don't have to trigger it that turn. You can have it sit out there until it's ready to trigger. But honestly, you're using a lot of the resources in your hand every turn. You're wanting to make sure you get the techniques up. There's other things you want to do to build Nebula up. So it seems like to play this for a future turn, for when that moment happens that you thwart and remove all the threat, for it to trigger isn't always at the top of your agenda. So I didn't always want to be playing it. When I did and it did trigger, you have to look at it as, let's say Nebula has 2 thwart, right? That base 2 thwart that she has. She hasn't been increased. And there's 2 threat in the main scheme. The main scheme is likely not out of control with only 2 threat on it. So yes, I can thwart, remove that 2 threat, discard this, and ready again. But I had to pay the resources for this. So I essentially paid 2 cards, like 1 resource for this and another card, to remove that 2 threat the Nebula has as a base thwart, which is a big overpay, just to ready Nebula to do something else, which in the first place I probably could have just left the 2 threat on the main scheme and just done what I wanted to do in the first place with Nebula, and it wouldn't have been a big deal. Yes, there are some schemes where that 2 threat is like, you know, for a solo game, you're hitting the threshold at 3 or 5 or whatever the case may be. But generally, it's not on your priority list to just get rid of that last 2 threats. So that's where I ran into issues with Justice Served. There was too many times where it was just like, I guess I could use this, and I guess it's not bad, but it's never phenomenal. It's never great. It's never like having these huge moments. And I feel like maybe if you're using it in a hero specifically where you are able to build that hero's thwart up really high, like 4 or something like that, or 5 even. I don't even know how easy it is for a hero to get to 5. It's been a while since I built a hero around that, but then maybe it makes more sense, because if there's 4 or 5 threat in a scheme and you really need to manage it, and you're able to remove all that and get an entire next turn and maybe do another thwart on a side scheme, or then get an attack or something else to trigger, then maybe it's more useful. It just, in Nebula specifically, even when I was able to get her up to 3 threat, I didn't honestly find it to be that great of a card. It still felt like one of those cards I would flip out for something else to build a stronger deck. So decent, but it wasn't one of my favorite cards by any means in this deck. All right, next we have One Way or Another. This is an interesting card. So this is a 0 cost event, max 1 per round, so you can't just like, you know, get a hand of 3 of these and just throw them all out there and draw a bunch of cards. Search the encounter deck for a side scheme, reveal that side scheme, draw 3 cards, shuffle the encounter deck. So this is pretty good in that, but you do have to make sure that you are aware of the villain you're playing and what's in the deck. So for instance, one way I use this, and I felt safe using it, was with Claw. So Claw, when he switches to a second form, I can't remember the name of the card, but that side scheme automatically, the Immortal Claw I think it's called, comes into play automatically, which gives him I think like plus 10 hit points or something. So you know when you switch forms, that is coming out one way or another. I was in the first form of Claw, and I had One Way or Another in my hand, and I already had played, there was, in the discard pile, I had already discarded most, if not all, of the other side schemes that were in the deck. So I knew that I could play One Way or Another, and Immortal Claw would come out, but I knew Immortal Claw was eventually going to come out anyways, that I wasn't, and I was at a stage of the first form that I didn't care about the extra hit points it was going to add on. And yes, like, maybe this is a bad example because then Immortal Claw might come out again in the second form, but regardless, it didn't affect my game state for Claw to have an extra 10 hit points in that moment. I knew I could get rid of the scheme very easily when it was out, and I wouldn't have to, like, you know, take care of the 10 hit points off Claw to be able to beat the first form. I could right away deal with it. The 3 cards that I'm going to draw were going to help me do that. I think if you know the side scheme that you're going to get out, or it's going to be something that you know you can manage because you're playing a Justice deck, this is a really solid card. You're basically trading in this card for, you know, three. I guess you're getting 1 card back for it, and you're getting 2 additional cards. So it always helped me. Again, when you're playing Nebula and you're wanting to get a bunch of techniques out, you're very often going to draw into a technique that's going to give you way more that you can do. I used it pretty often. I think there was only 1 instance where I used it in the side scheme that came out, really put me in a bind, because I thought, hey, I have a bunch of ways to thwart, so I'm going to be able to manage this. But it had just more thwart than I could deal with, which made me have to draw in a counter card in the next turn, which really set me back. So like that will happen, but if you think that you have a controlled board state, if you think you're in a position where you know which side scheme is going to come up and you can manage it, one way or another is a really cheap and easy way to draw 3 cards. I trade this one for 3 different cards, and that is sometimes going to make all the difference in having this huge snowball turn for you with Nebula. So I really enjoyed it. Okay, so this card next we're going to talk about, technically, this was first debuted in Mad Titan Shadow, but because I don't have that, this is my first instance of this card. So normally I don't review cards that I've already reviewed in a past set. I just kind of skip over them. You're going to notice in Mad Titan Shadow, I'll end up skipping over this card because we've talked about it here. So we've kind of done this backwards. This is Determination. So Determination is a resource card, max 1 per deck. Hero response: after you spend this card, remove 1 threat from the main scheme, and it has a wild resource is what it generates. So it's not overly fancy. Sometimes removing 1 threat from the main scheme is enough to get it within range that you can then remove it all to be able to trigger, Justice Served, or maybe there's only 1 threat on it and it's an easy way to not have to like waste a use of your hero to remove that 1 threat, to empty a main scheme for Venom to not have to take as much consequential damage. There are situations that have arisen specifically in my games that I was happy to have Determination, but I would say that it's less often that 1 threat removal is going to make such a big deal to you that you're going to like definitely want to always include this. Like it's only going to be a 1 of anyways. It's only going to take up a single spot. If you find that you have an extra spot and that's something that could help you out in the right situation, that you're willing to include it, by all means. But I wouldn't say this is like an overly powerful card. But it does generate a wild resource, and it can, for basically something you're going to do anyways, paying for a card, it can do an additional effect that might help you out of a jam, or clear a card that otherwise you didn't want to have to spend a bunch of resources to deal with. So it can still be really good. And the last one we're going to talk about is Brains over Brawn, and this is the most disappointing card in the deck for me. So I'm not going to pretend that I have thought of every possibility with this card, and I know that there are likely some heroes that could really utilize Brains over Brawn, and that's why cards like this can still exist in the game. They might not seem overly powerful, and you might look at it and say, how many times am I possibly going to utilize this card, or this is only useful in this one hero? That's okay. Like, the amount of times that cards can be introduced in a game like this and have it only be functional for a couple heroes, I think it's good to have cards like that. It makes deck building a little more interesting for one hero than another one, and it's okay to have those cards. It's just interesting to me that this is introduced in Nebula specifically, because I never found that I ever wanted to play this card in any of the games I was playing. So, Brains over Brawn is a 2-cost event. Hero response: attack after your hero makes a basic thwart, deal damage to an enemy equal to your hero's thwart. In this deck, I never had, in the base cards, because I'm testing it based on the cards that come in it, I never had Nebula's threat over, threat removal over 3. So her thwart was 3, which means that for 2, I'm doing 3 damage, which is Haymaker, but there's a condition attached to it that I have to be thwarting to be able to do that 3 damage. If I'm not thwarting that turn, this is now a useless card in my hand. So it's a Haymaker with a condition, which is really bad. So I didn't really like it. Again, I think the reason this card exists is not to be in a deck like this. That's why I'm grading it right now. If you have it in a deck where you are reliably able to get your thwart up to 4, up to 5, for instance, whether it's temporarily, whether it's permanently, for 2 damage to do 4 or 5 damage, as a Justice card, that could be pretty good. And the fact that you have 3 of them and you're able to do that 3 times over the course of going through a deck, that can be really good. Like, there are opportunities, is what I should say, for Brains over Brawn to be good, but in my experience in Nebula, not very good. So I would say, I'm not saying this is a bad card. I'm saying that right now, I'm not super into Brains over Brawn, but I'm excited to see as more heroes get introduced, and potentially if we get one that has really high threat removal, maybe we look back at Brains over Brawn and say, hey, this is a deck now we're going to slot into. This is one of those cards you want to keep in the back of your mind, and all of a sudden when some crazy hero gets introduced that has like 0 attack, 0 defense, but 5 thwart, we're all going to look over and say, well, Brains over Brawn. Time to make your way out of the, blow the dust off of the card, bring it out of your collection, and put it into that deck or something. So it exists. At some point, we might find more use out of it. I'm sure someone in the comments is going to tell me that there's a deck that they've used it in that's been really effective, and I think that's awesome. I just didn't think Nebula was the right deck for it. So Lastly, before we get into the obligation and the the extra cards that are included, we have the one new basic card that we had never seen before, and that is Daughters of Thanos. So this is a team-up card with Gamora and Nebula, of course. Max 1 per deck, hero action, draw 3 cards. So very simple. You're going to be paying this card and a resource. So you're going to be paying 2 cards to draw 3 cards. It's not crazy, it's not overly amazing. That being said, there was enough times that I was able to use this that I had cards in my hand I wanted to cycle for new ones, and the 3 cards I drew were specifically techniques or things that I could utilize this turn. Like it's one thing to look at and say, oh, you're trading 2 cards essentially for 3. Like you really only gained a card. Yes, and there's a condition of, a condition attached to that, so it might not seem overly powerful. But sometimes you can also look at it as I'm flipping 2 cards out of my hand to get 3 new opportunities for me to be able to do more in this turn, to be able to set up more techniques that are going to trigger on the next turn I begin or something. I got enough out of this that a couple times that the board state called for that I was able to do it, that I really enjoyed the card. I liked it a lot. Again, it's not always going to work. Sometimes it's just going to be a resource. It is a wild resource, which means it has some flexibility there for you as well. I thought it was good. It's not the best team-up card, but I think it's one that you're not going to be disappointed by it when you use it, saying, oh, I wish it was that didn't have as much of an effect as I wanted. I think you'll get a decent effect out of it, and you're going to draw into some opportunities that you're going to be able to use. So those are all the player cards. Now we're going to look in at the obligation, the obligation and the minion and the side scheme. There's a whole bunch of stuff we're going to look at here. So let's jump right into the remaining cards of this deck. All right, the obligation is Inferiority Complex, which is you may flip to alter ego form. Choose exhaust your alter ego, remove this from the game, or choose and discard 2 technique upgrades you control. If no upgrade was discarded this way, this card gains surge and discard the obligation. I thought this was super interesting because normally this is a pretty standard obligation. It has one thing that involves exhausting your alter ego, and it has one that affects like a playstyle of the hero you're playing. But because Nebula often wants to go to alter ego every single turn, I never had the obligation come up and had to be that much of a big deal to me. I would look at it as, oh, I was probably going to go to alter ego anyways. Yes, I'm exhausted now, but it allows me to play this, technique and draw a card, or because I'm in alter ego next turn to begin or whatever. Like it wasn't that much of a detriment to have to go to alter ego. The exhaust, of course, sucked, but this almost just helped me go to alter ego if I wasn't able to do it, and then saved my techniques. So if I was in hero form and then this got drawn on the villain's turn, all my techniques were going to discard, unless I really wanted them to alter their special specifically at that moment. It made them all last longer for all the lasting effects that were on them, and just made it so that I just had a more powerful turn where they all trigger because I was able to play more before that happened. So I actually didn't mind this obligation. It's an interesting obligation in that sense. It almost is more helpful to me. I never ever once chose the one where you discard 2 techniques. It just never made sense to me. I don't know. There might be a specific situation where you're like on the brink of winning where you just do not want to exhaust. But for me, I just always use the top one. It was actually never a big deal. So pretty cool. Next up is the Minion. So the Minion is Gamora. We talked about this, just like the Gamora pack where Nebula was the ally and the Nemesis. The Nemesis Minion here is Gamora, just like there's an ally for Gamora. So just like in that case, the forced interrupt is when this minion would enter play, you have to discard the Gamora ally from play. So that's an added detriment to this card, is if you have a situation where you have that ally out for protection, Gamora coming out is going to have you lose your defenses. 2 scheme and 2 attack, 6 health, pretty high health. The force response on the attack is after Gamora attacks and damages you, choose and discard an upgrade you control. So pretty nasty because, again, your upgrades are a big part of what you're doing, all your techniques. She does have to attack and damage you. So if you block with an ally, if you have a tough status card on you, or she's stunned or whatever, there are ways to avoid it. It's not like every single time she initiates an attack, you're going to be losing one. That I didn't find to be as hard to work around. Really, it was just the 6 health for me that I was having to deal with. Playing Nebula solo as a Justice hero with a 6 health Nemesis minion like this out, it isn't always the easiest thing to get rid of. If you have Weapons Master, I think is what the card's called, out, that's 4 damage right there. That makes it a lot easier. A single trigger of that and Man, how many times have I got to knock this over in the video? A single trigger of the Weapons Master and a base attack from Nebula is going to get rid of Gamora. So pretty nasty Nemesis minion, but I wouldn't say it's the nastiest one we've seen or you know, the worst one we've seen by any means. But one that's definitely going to give you some trouble and might cause you to lose your Gamora ally, which can really suck. So next up is the side scheme, Self-Preservation. Nebula gets -1 thwart, -1 attack, -1 defense. Gamora gets +1 attack, and her attacks gain piercing. This is surprisingly bad. This being out, you know, you have other things you're wanting to deal with, and I would think like, okay, I'll get rid of that in a second. And I'd have to keep remembering, oh man, I'm down to 1 attack, I'm down to 1 thwart. And sometimes that would really, really hamper me. The defense wasn't as big of a deal in my games, but the thwart and the attack was. And if Gamora happens to be out, this can be really devastating as well with the piercing and stuff. So it's really easy to get rid of. It's only 2 threat per player. As a solo player, that's nothing. It's a single, you know, well, I guess not a single base thwart from Nebula because she's down to 1. But, you know, if you have an ally out, it's very easy to get rid of. So I wouldn't say it's the worst thing to have that side scheme be out. You're going to get rid of it fairly quickly. But while it is out, it might, you know, change your focus a little bit to make sure you focus on getting that dealt with. If using Nebula's base abilities is something you have in your strategy, this can really put you know, a detriment on that. So you're gonna have to turn around and decide what you're gonna do now to get rid of it before you go back to your main plan. So overall though, I would say it's pretty easy to deal with. All right, Old Rivals. So when revealed, Gamora attacks you. If no attacks were made this way, this card gains Surge. If the Gamora Hero Ally is in play, she resolves her attack against you without exhausting. So really interesting. So when revealed, Gamora is going to attack you. If no attack was made this way, as like basically Gamora is not in play, this card gains Surge, so you're not getting off easy, you're just gonna have to draw into another card. But if the Gamora Hero or Ally is in play, she resolves her attack against you without exhausting. So this doesn't just trigger on the Nemesis. If you were doing a game that someone else was playing Gamora, Gamora is going to attack you without exhausting from the hero. If your ally is in play, the ally is going to attack you without exhausting. That's a big deal. Like, if this was just the Nemesis minion, that would be one thing. And that's how I kind of thought it was at first. But the fact that it can trigger off any Gamora in play, and there's multiple Gamoras that could be in play, is super thematic and super cool. I really, really love this card. I love the idea of it bringing your allies and other heroes into play against you. I think that I'd like to see more of that in future, you know, in future decks and future packs. Ways to have like this like friendly fire aspect continue on. I feel like it just adds this extra, you know, sense of I don't even know what the word is. I can't find the word right now. But just it's an extra thing you're worried about in the board state. And I really like the idea that, hey, just because Gamora, the villain, or the Nemesis isn't in play doesn't mean you're scot-free. Like, you might have gotten rid of her and now you have the Gamora ally in play and you think you're safe, and then all of a sudden you draw Old Rivals and you're having to deal with that. So I think that's really cool. And there's 2 copies of them, so you will be seeing them a lot if you've drawn Shadows of the Past. Last up is Lethal Weapon, which I have to say, the artwork on this is absolutely devastating. I feel like in the movies, we see that they have a rivalry and they're fighting each other, but I've never seen Gamora completely stab Nebula through the chest, or through the back, through the chest. That is brutal artwork. Very good artwork, though. So this is attached to Gamora if you cannot attach to the villain. Discard an upgrade, hero action, discard an upgrade you control to discard this attachment. Why would you want to do that? Because it's giving them +1 attack. So nothing crazy here. They get an additional attack, whether that's Gamora or the villain. If you want to get rid of it, you're getting rid of one of your techniques, essentially, or one of your upgrades, which isn't that big of a deal, especially depending which one you're getting rid of. I would say that that's really, really easy to deal with. The couple times I got it out, I just got rid of the one that allowed me to look at 3 cards at the top of the encounter deck, and that was it. It was done. So pretty easy to deal with. I wouldn't say that's anything you really have to worry about. Okay, and with that, we are into the additional cards that are included in the pack. These aren't part of Nebula's deck, but you can use them across deck building for the entire scope of the game. So we have cards from every single aspect. The first one we're going to look at is Energy Spear. This is the aggression card. This is a 1-cost upgrade. It's a weapon attached to a Guardian ally, max 1 per ally. Attached ally gets +2 attack, and its attacks gain piercing. I think this is pretty solid. Again, I don't often play a lot of decks that, you know, rely on really powering up allies and having like allies, and because I guess I'm thinking more of leadership in that sense. Like, I don't play an ally specific game often. As much as I love allies, I love including the ones that I like or the ones that help me out, but it's never my main strategy is never utilizing and empowering up my allies is the best way I can mention it. But that being said, this is a really solid card for 1. It's in aggression, which is an aspect I love to play, and there are enough allies that I could see powering up with a +2 attack and piercing for 1 and getting like multiple uses out of, where this is not just 1 for 2 damage. This is, you know, if you put on a fresh ally that has, you know, 3 swings available, this is 1 for 6 essentially, and has piercing across that. So I actually really like this card. I think it's a great inclusion, and I think that even though it does have to be a Guardian ally, like you can't just put this onto any ally that you have in the deck, I think that there's still enough targets that, especially because a lot of the Guardians are basic allies, so you can include them anyways. I think there's enough targets that you're going to get some use out of this, and I think that it's going to be a fun one to play around with. So I really like that inclusion. The next one is Guardians of the Galaxy is the name of the card. This is a 2-cost support. It's a leadership card. Play under any player's control, max 1 team card per player. This is a team card. The team trait is on it. If each of your characters has the Guardian trait, this card gains response after you play an upgrade on an ally, draw 1 card. So again, this is a very specific card. You're playing this in a deck that you've specifically built around allies, specifically Guardian allies. You want to have all Guardian characters out, including the character that you're playing with. And if you're doing that, you also want to have built a bunch of upgrades in, because every single time you play an upgrade, you're going to draw a card. So like, again, it's very specific. You're having to build a very specific deck to utilize it. But if you have followed those, you know, that framework, and you're playing that kind of leadership deck, this is going to be a super powerful card. You're going to find yourself drawing cards constantly just for doing things you would normally be doing. So it's hard for me to completely grade that card now because I don't specifically play that deck. But that being said, it's a card that makes you, I like cards that make you want to try a new archetype. And that does make me want to try a new archetype. It makes me want to try to build a deck around that concept and then have this card complement it and see how it, you know, really elevates it, how it works. So really cool inclusion. I think it's going to allow for some deck building possibilities. I'm never against that. All right. Defensive training. So defensive training is max 2 per deck, so we only get 2 of them. Comes with 2 uses, which is 2 training counters. Alter Ego, so 1 cost support, I should have said. Alter Ego action, so use an Alter Ego form, exhaust this card and remove 1 of those 2 training counters from it. Choose a protection green event in your discard pile and shuffle it into your deck. I like this card for the possibilities because yes, it has to be used in Alter Ego form. Yes, you're only gonna have 2 in your deck, so it's not gonna come up as frequently. But there's so many protection cards already in the game. There's so many heroes that are specifically you want to be played in protection, that being able to twice return a protection card back to your deck reliably with this in a deck that normally might not have had that functionality just allows for some possibilities that weren't normally there. And I like when cards introduce that. So it's hard for me to grade this immediately, but it's a card I'm going to be going back and looking at protection heroes I like to play, like Quicksilver, for instance, and say, what can I build this as now, knowing that there's some green cards here that I can get back more frequently than I otherwise would have. So maybe I can include them less copies in the deck because I can just replenish my deck using defensive training. Like, there's different things you can consider. I just like when they include new cards like that make you rethink some of the things you've already, you know, dabbled in. All right, and the basic card is Honorary Guardian, a 0-cost upgrade. Play only if your identity has the Guardian trait. Attached to a friendly character, max 1 per character. Attached character gets a single hit point increase and gains the Guardian trait. So the key here is obviously going to be using this on, you know how many times in this video have I said the key here? I feel like that could have been a drinking game in the Nebula review. Every time Dylan says this is the key or the key here, you take a shot. Anyways, the important thing to note here is that there are cards like we just went over with Guardians of the Galaxy, the leadership card, where you're going to need the Guardian trait specifically on allies. This allows you to be able to include cards in your deck that don't have the Guardian trait, and then with the plan being add Honorary Guardian onto them, increase their hit points, which is already a really good thing for an ally, and give them the Guardian trait to be able to meet the conditions of other cards. So you're not going to include, this isn't like one of those cards you're just going to include randomly in a bunch of Guardian decks. You're going to include it specifically when you have cards that you want to be able to meet that requirement for, or you have allies that you specifically want to increase the longevity by add-on hit points. Ideally, both of those things is something you're looking for, and then the 3 copies would be amazing in your deck. So the very, very last thing I want to mention is it does come with a 2nd copy of Daughters of Thanos. That's really good because even though it's max 1 per deck, now you can play with Gamora having 1 in her deck and Nebula having 1 in her deck. So I'm really glad they included the 2nd copy of Daughters of Thanos. So that is the entire Nebula hero. So what are my thoughts on Nebula? I think Nebula is a really unique hero and one that I have had a lot of fun playing. I think Nebula is a very specific type of playstyle. You have to be okay with the fact that you keep thinking you're doing a whole bunch and then not starting from ground zero, not starting from scratch, but you're having a bunch of those pieces removed from your play and then having to rebuild them up again. That could be a really satisfying thing to do, to constantly be like building up Nebula, big turn, and then going back to square one, and then building up Nebula. Like, you constantly feel like you have this engine you're constantly having to build, and you have this reward that you reap, and then you have to do it again, and you can do it in a slightly different way, or you can time it differently. That's really fun. It's a constantly evolving puzzle, is the best way I can think to describe it, that you're constantly doing. That playstyle might not be for everyone. It's going to add a whole bunch of extra anxiety. It's going to add a whole bunch of other, unknown to what you're doing, because sometimes you're going to build up Nebula and have it trigger in not the way you thought, because the villain's turn went a certain way, and now the board state's different on your turn when the force response happens and all your techniques trigger. So you do have to have a really good grasp and idea of what's going on in the board state to be able to utilize Nebula like in the best way possible. But I think that it's a really fun way to play Marvel Champions, and I have had a lot of fun with Nebula. I wouldn't necessarily rank Nebula as like one of my top 5 heroes. I've seen a lot of people rank Nebula in top 5, and I know that could be from a power level perspective, or I could see that be from like a personal perspective. I'm just saying from a personal preference, she's not one of my top 5 that I enjoy playing, but she's definitely not in the bottom either. Like, I would say either somewhere around the middle or even higher up. I really enjoy that playstyle, and I really enjoy the way my games felt a little frantic. And it also felt oddly satisfying to win with Nebula. Like, not that it's like, I wouldn't have expected to win, but there was just this extra satisfaction that came with winning as Nebula and having it really feel like you earned that win, whereas some heroes, it just felt a little bit easier to get to that win. So I really like Nebula. The 9 hit points is pretty low when I'm playing solo, and I do play a lot of solo. There are ways in the deck, especially with some of her cards, to minimize the damage that's incoming to her, and it does have a lot of allies available to her, and you can include more to be able to mitigate that as well. But overall, I really like Nebula. I think it's a really solid hero. It's not one I'm disappointed with by any means. From a thematic standpoint, or not even thematic, from a character standpoint, out of all the ones we're seeing come up right away, she was the one that I would say least excited for, out of like War Machine and Vision and the ones we just recently got, like Venom, Gamora, Drax, and Star-Lord and everything. I wasn't overly excited for Nebula, but having played Nebula now, I'm actually really happy with the version we got of her, and I think that she slots in really nicely to some of the play styles that I enjoy playing, even if it's not ones I enjoy playing like frequently in Marvel Champions. So those are my thoughts on Nebula. Let me know in the comments where Nebula slots for you. So I know it's pretty early. You may have just got Nebula. Maybe you got Nebula like last week. How are you enjoying her? Is she in your top 5? Is she in your top 10? Where do you think she ranks in power level? I know we need more time to really see that. Let me know if you have any cool like deck ideas or different combinations you've included with Nebula, or if there's cards I reviewed here that you have found different uses for that I didn't mention. I'd love to hear all that in the comments as normal. It's been a while since I did one of these reviews, but it's really good to be back at it and to be able to communicate with you guys in the comments and just discuss things and converse with Marvel Champions. As I mentioned in the beginning, I hope that I will begin Mad Titan Shadow this month sometime, and as soon as I do, I will be cranking out a whole bunch of content. We'll have a review of each of the heroes separately. We'll have a review of the entire box in and of itself. At some point, we're going to be getting War Machine and Vision, and Vision we haven't even got the preview article for, so that's a little further off. But War Machine and the Hood are going to be coming really soon. My goal, because I've had people mention in the comments before that they really want to see me do playthroughs, and I just haven't had the time with a bunch of other stuff we're doing on the channel. My goal is for the Hood scenario pack, because it is a scenario pack that I'm going to try to take a hero or two, whether it be solo, whether it be like two-handed solo, through the Hood and actually do a full playthrough video and have it be my first playthrough, my first dabble in doing a playthrough. So keep an eye out for that. I'm going to try my best to stick to that. But otherwise, all that content on review and like my thoughts on all this kind of stuff, and whenever we get the Vision preview article, I will be going over all that as well. So lots of exciting stuff to come from Marvel Champions. So keep your eyes on the channel. If you're not subscribed, subscribe so you don't miss anything. You'll see every single new update as I post them. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. See you next time.